Okay. So, top of the morning, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Waterstone Media Podcast. My name is Brian Kirk, and as always, I am joined by the most angelic of creatures, Taylor Crook.
Angelic, like it's because I'm backlit right now.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Taylor, how has this week been for you in terms of what you have been reading or watching?
Ooh, can I actually jump into what I've been playing? Because
Absolutely.
I stumbled into a game that concerns me in terms of how much it might eat into my writing time. It was a free game on the PS Network, which I always appreciate when they put out something that I'm interested in. It's called Slay the Spire, and it is a roguelike RPG, and the combat is card-based. It's like a deck-based game. So I'm just getting into it. I'm a couple 2-3 hours maybe of playtime at this point, but it's fun. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't played a lot of deck building games, but not in a video game context, in just like a Magic the Gathering, whatever. You build a specific deck, right? Like you have cards that you like, you build it, and you have certain tactics that you want to execute, and they get shuffled into your deck. And there is a randomness to the deck as they come out, but it's a deck that you've built. That's correct, right?
In broad strokes, yes.
Okay.
There are exceptions to any sentence that you said, but yes.
Okay, fair
In broad strokes, you are correct.
So the thing about this game that I'm unsure if I'm going to get past or not is that because it's a roguelike, every time you start with a standard deck for whatever your character is, and then as you move forward, you get more cards, and you can sort of develop tactics based on the cards that you get, which is very standard for a roguelike. I enjoy that style of play. I think my issue is, and this may iron itself out as I learn the game a little bit more and what to do, but with the enemies being random, the path being random, the cards that you receive to build your deck being random, to then get into the conflict, combat, and have the deck still be a random pull, it feels like just a little bit too much that you can't control. There's too many times that I've had a run that's going really, really well, and then I just draw 0 defense cards against a boss for the first 3 rounds, and I've knocked half his health out, but I'm dead because I haven't had the opportunity to I'm not tactically playing poorly, but I've not been given the opportunity to defend myself once, which I understand is the nature of a deck-based game. But because everything else is so random as well, it just feels like too much that I don't have any control over. So I'm not sure if that will iron itself out or not, but for now, I am all in, despite the frustration.
I have not played, but it is one of the many, many, many games on my to-play list, and something that people I respect have really enjoyed and spoken highly about.
That's good. Okay, that makes me feel like as I go, and because as you go, you unlock more cards and abilities and stuff as well. So it does feel like that will, which is the way of roguelikes. There's always a 4 to 5 hour mark, almost like the first, like as you've passed the first quarter of the game, where the difficulty is up, but you haven't quite unlocked enough to get, and you're just like, what is this? What is happening right now? And it's something you generally have to just sort of push through. So
cool. On my end, I have mostly been rereading Dune, inspired in part by our own conversation and having watched the movie several months back. I had not read it in at least the better part of a decade, if not even longer. And I find that I am enjoying it far more even now than I did on my first read through when I did enjoy it. So that has been something really fun and something that I may want to talk with you about, Taylor, probably even online on this podcast, because there's just so many cool things happening in that book.
I'm in. I am 100% in, because I agree with you. Every time I reread that book, I enjoy it more. It's up there. It's one of my favorites. I believe it was in my top 5. So makes sense.
Click on the link above where my finger might be, and it'll take you to Taylor's top 5. So today we are continuing our discussion of fighting and fight scenes. And last week we focused a lot on movies and cinema just to gain an understanding of what we wanted in those forms of media. Today we're moving more into the realm of writing and our stories. And so I'm just going to hopefully lead off with a simple question. Apparently I failed last week, but as a reader, Taylor, how action heavy or action forward do you consider yourself to be? Do you want a fight scene on every chapter, every other chapter? Or are you the sort of person who prefers one big set piece near the end?
It's funny. I've been thinking about that since we decided on this subject matter. And I think I would have said, yeah, give me all the action a little while ago, but maybe not a little while. I guess without thinking about it, I would have said that. Now I think I don't mind the action being spaced out and the development of the characters being a little more forward, and which makes sense because, you know, we're reading a book. We have the advantage of time and space to let characters breathe and develop and worlds build and to really transport yourself into a story. So it's not 42 minutes on Netflix, and you need to get the plot, the development, and the 2 big fight scenes in, which I have no problem with. I love all of those things. But why not take the time if you've got the book and the time to do it in, which probably sounds surprising based on the amount of action we crammed into Path of the Eternal Sun. But some stories call for that. And I think that story calls for that, particularly when you have a character like Beast. I think he is prone to violence. That's how he develops.
Just like the man who came up with him, really.
Yeah, exactly. Wait, is Beast my alter ego?
This is something that I actually think a fair amount about, because certainly when I was younger, I was the sort of reader who really enjoyed the action scenes and the set pieces, whatever form they may take. One of my favorite series growing up was all of the books and novels set in the BattleTech universe. And generally speaking, you're not going more than a couple of chapters without giant robots trying to destroy each other.
Yeah, they don't have like a giant robot tea party?
No, which is exactly what I was going for. That is exactly what I wanted. It was, I would skip through everything else to get to the next fight scene. And definitely over time, that has changed almost to the point where it's been flipped on its head, where depending on the book, I will almost skim through the fight scenes to get to the other parts of the story because I find them more interesting and engaging than 2 people trying to beat the snot out of one another. And I kind of know why that is. It's a little bit related to the character building and what makes stories important to me. But I guess turning the question back on you, Taylor, as you are thinking about writing a story, and you are right now in the middle of editing 2 large epic fantasy books, when you are looking at fight scenes, what are the sorts of things that you are paying attention to? What do you want fight scenes to accomplish in your stories?
So I love that you phrased it that way, because I think that's the biggest understanding that I've come to as a writer is that fight scenes need to accomplish something more than just being a thing that happens. And I think instinctively, not to toot my own horn here, but I think instinctively I did have a level of understanding of that when I wrote Infernal Shadow almost 5 years ago now, which is crazy to say out loud. That, you know, the first draft of it, it was, okay, yep, we need some action, but it was more of how does this sequence move the story forward? Whether it's moving where the characters are going in terms of accomplishing their goal, whether it is a moment of realization for some of those characters. And I had to clean a lot of it up, but those elements were still there in Infernal Shadow. And I think by the time I got around to writing Sentinels with you, writing Path specifically, I think that was sort of already in my mind that we needed to be, if we're giving Beast a scene where he saves sort of the day by going into a berserker rage and accomplishing something that nobody else could, why? What's important about that? And then you write the scene accordingly. And that worked. We established very early that Beast had already gathered most of the bandits in Samus to his cause. But the reader doesn't know why. We told them why. We told them that he did it. So that reader needs to see, oh, this is why. Because he will put himself on the line for his own people. And not only that, but he's capable of doing that thing. And you probably don't want to be on the other side of it. So it's just, I think it's a very small realization to come to, and it seems very obvious. But if you had asked me if I was doing that when I wrote Infernal Shadow, I would have not had that idea in my mind that I was, despite the fact that each of those sequences did in some way, you know, move it forward. You know, it put somebody in danger. It made someone realize they cared more than they thought. It made someone realize they have a weakness that they didn't know about, whatever those things are. So I just think it's important, because it's not a visual medium, it's important that if you are spending those words describing an action sequence, there needs to be more to it than the action sequence itself.
One thing that I find really interesting about not just fight scenes, but really any form of physical expression is how potent of a tool that is for expressing character. I know that I heard this first probably in the realm of martial arts back when I was far more active in those fields. But there is this general sense that you will know a person better after sparring with them for 5 minutes than you will after a year of conversation. You might not know the details of their history, and you may not know where they went to school or what they do for work, but you will know their character after you spar with them. And I think that I found that to be true in my own experience, where you knew the people who were aggressive. You knew the people who were willing to win, even if it meant pushing the bounds of the rules or what was safe. And it all happens very quick. And I feel like if you can capture some of that character in any of their physical actions, it could be true of a fight scene or a duel. I think one of my favorite scenes that I've written actually in the past year and a half is a character struggling with claustrophobia in a tight space and having to push themselves through just a physically really tight space, and how they handled their fear in that moment was one of my favorite pieces of writing that I've put together. And so having that as a tool in the toolbox for revealing character, and those are my favorite fight scenes too, which we will probably be talking about next week. But my favorite fight scenes in all of literature are the fight scenes where you learn something about a character that you might not have known otherwise that would never come to the surface in day-to-day, regular, mundane interactions.
And even more to that point, that character wouldn't know about if they didn't get thrown into this circumstance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a vehicle for a character to also learn more about themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that I find really interesting about Path of the Eternal Sun is that we have three main characters who have very different backgrounds, from Beast, who is an enormous giant man who towers over everyone and is stronger than everyone, to Sato, who is better trained and is perhaps one of the best swordsmen in the entire world, to Shin, who, when we first meet her, is really little more than a child. And yet, all of them end up having to fight their way through some of the scenes in the novel. I'm curious, what were you keeping in mind as you were writing these three different characters with such different physical traits?
So I guess a couple things. From a raw mechanics perspective, Beast was going to be overwhelming and physical, but reckless and untrained. So I wanted that. He's good. He's very good. He'd be hard to beat, but whatever he was doing, whether he was fighting with his hands or a weapon, I wanted him to be unhinged almost when he was in battle. And part of that, which is kind of fun, I don't know if I should, I guess it's not a reveal. In the first book, Beast breaks his weapon every single fight that he's in. Not once does his weapon survive a fight that he's in. And that was intentional, because that's just how he does it. He's not careful. So then to write Sato, I always wanted it to be so much more calculated and calm and no emotion whatsoever. Just purely tactical and training. And I think he takes a great joy in the martial aspects of his swordsmanship, but the act itself is just part of his duty. Fighting somebody, killing somebody, drawing blood, it's duty. And not that he doesn't enjoy it or abhor it. He just does it. It's just part of the path that he walks. So those two were almost a dichotomy, because they were such big extremes from one to the other. And then Shin was honestly the most challenging, because I needed to have this girl that had never fought before and was in fact fairly afraid of conflict in her when we first meet her, learn to find that sort of inner strength in herself to fight, to do all of these things. And obviously I wasn't going to kill her off in the first 5 chapters, so she had to survive. So it was about finding a way for her to almost muddle through, and she had a little training, but not, nothing crazy. So it was a little challenging to make it believably difficult for her and see the growth that she had. I think there's a reason that you either have an established character that knows how to fight, or you have a character that's never fought before but is thrown into training. Those are the things that you usually see, right? So she was kind of in the middle, because there wasn't really anyone training her. So, and I mean, I say I when I write this. Obviously, between the two of us, we crafted these things, but that was what was in my brain.
But in fairness, you were doing the vast majority of the first drafting, and so a lot of this is coming from you, and I was more the guy coming behind and just refining what had been already done. So
right, yeah, exactly.
So this was an interesting question that I was actually in a debate with a friend literally before we hopped on the podcast. And he was asking, as somebody who is not an author, how one approaches the expression of detail in a fight. He was wondering if it made more sense to write a single fight with an incredible level of detail, or if it made more sense to write a scene with less detail so that the reader can let their imagination do more of the work. It seems like a dilemma that's unique to books, because in any other medium that is more visual, that fight is going to be presented to you. It's going to be right in front of you. Only with books, really, do you have that choice of how much you want to reveal. And I'm curious how you think about that as you're approaching a new fight scene, Taylor.
It's so funny because when I first sat down to write Infernal Shadow, I had that same inner dialogue with myself, just about the story generally, where I said, okay, do I want to be inspired by Tolkien and describe every flower petal that our heroes pass on the way and how it makes them feel and what it reminds them of? Or do I want it to be a little bit more broad and allow the reader to fill in the blanks? And for me, excruciating detail is wasted, because one way or the other, I end up with a person in my, like, looking the way they look in my head. To the point where if someone's name, the first time I read it, if I just say it wrong based on how it's spelled, it's in my head forever that way. There's no amount of being told the right way to pronounce the name that will change it. So I find so many of my opinions on everything are formed for myself, because that's what I'm doing. I'm reading the book for me, that I was like, okay, I'm just going to set the stage, and we'll let the descriptions will be for the things that need it, and we'll let the reader form the rest of how they want it to be. In terms of fight scenes, I feel like I almost do the opposite. I feel like I'm fairly specific about what is going on and what's, how they're achieving it. Maybe, I don't know, maybe too specific. There were some fight scenes in Infernal Shadow that I trimmed up a little bit, because it felt like there was a bit too much description of exactly the thrust of the blade. So it's funny. So I think I tend to lean towards more description. I mean, you've read more of my fight scenes than anyone in the world. Would you agree with that?
Yes. He thrust upward at 32 degrees using 12 newtons of force. Taylor, you really don't need to be this specific.
Hold on a second. I'm calculating PSI.
What the place where I think that I have landed on this after writing a lot of fight scenes over the years is that the amount of detail I use is actually fairly contextual. And I think it ties back again to how much character is being revealed, or if I am revealing something unique about the world. I think that perhaps if I was to compare it to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it would be the difference between the Avengers having to fight through a horde of CGI monsters, no single detail of which gains a lot of attention. They're just fighting their way through monsters, and there's a lot of pretty lights on the screen. Mm-hmm. Versus one of our protagonists going up against the antagonist at the end, or later on in the MCU when the Avengers fight the Avengers, because those are the moments that matter. Those are the moments that are important. And so I was even just looking through the last book that I had written, which is releasing next month here in May. And there's one huge fight scene where it is one against many enemies, and I think it lasts less than a page. But then very soon after that, the protagonist comes up against the antagonist, and one quick exchange lasts 2 or 3 pages. But it's because one of those moments revealed something about the character and the other did not so much. And so I think that is what leads me, or I guess that guides me in how much detail I want to express in any given fight scene.
Yeah. It reminds me of a DM that uses hordes in combat. So swarms of things that will do damage if you ignore them, but they go down in one hit. So that and then you've got a big bad at the end of that fight with more health that does more things. So, you roll, as long as you get a hit on the horde is gone. But you still need to, it's part of the process to get there. But the meaningful exchange is whatever the big bad is. Okay, that's where you have to like knuckle down into the combat and use strategy and think that way. I feel like it's a similar thing. They're both important in their own way, but how you approach them changes.
I think, too, that I will also add more detail. If I think that the fight scene is more unique, the other example is I had a fight scene on a collapsing building in this story. And that piece is written in a lot more detail simply because it was way more fun.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That makes a battle in a battlefield is just a battle in a battlefield. But, if it's a crumbling city, if it's on a boat, something like that.
Yeah. Well, those were the main questions that I had for you today. Taylor, did you want to wrap up with any final words on how you approach writing fight scenes, or maybe even how it's evolved over the last couple of years of writing?
I think, like all of my writing has evolved. It has become there's a lot more self-editing that goes into it. I've learned to trust my readers, that they understand that if a sword is being thrust, it's probably being thrust at appropriate.
At 32 newtons.
It's likely parallel to the ground. So it's been a lot of, and that's what a lot of the cleanup in the edit of Infernal Shadow has been for the combat scenes. Like, Stowback raised his sword to block, but I put Stowback raised his sword, pommel up with the blade facing the ground. So the sharp end was, and it's just like, no, all of that can go away. He blocked it.
Nice. Well, as always, for everybody listening, thank you so much for being here. And we will be back next week with a discussion of some of our favorite fight scenes in the written word. So we are cutting movies and cinema out of this. So I have no idea what Taylor's going to go with, and I hope it is super, super interesting.
Yeah, me too.
For everyone else, show notes, transcripts, all that can be found online as per usual. And thanks for being here.